You know, Dr. King used to end a lot of his speeches by talking about the long arc of the moral universe and how it would, bend toward justice, which was a paraphrasing of Theodore Parker, the great Unitarian Universalist minister of the 19th century. I had a friend, Charlie Clemens, who was, still is, and as a matter of fact, a person whose portrait I painted, who was the head of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. He worked all over the world for human rights. And one time we were talking about that long arc of the moral universe, and he said, well, not exactly. There is this long arc of the moral universe, and it may bend toward justice, but not by gravity. What it takes is all of us. It takes us pulling down on it, or it won't bend at all. It'll be the long arc of the immoral universe. What Bree Newsome did, is a huge yank on that arc. And it serves as a lesson for all of us about how much can be done. Often a lot is done obviously by organizing a lot of people, and sometimes an individual act by one person can be hugely effective. And that makes me want to say something, just the last thing I want to say right at this moment in introduction about the role of courage in our culture. Right here in this community this week, we've seen some cowardice, and which is very disappointing, but it also is a real good lesson about the things that drive a culture forward and pull a culture back. Courage pushes us forward, cowardice pulls us back. Another reason why courage is so important if we're going to, clean up our culture, make it more honest, more equal, more fair, more just. The other thing that's about courage is the person of courage, whether the person is 11 years old or 90 years old, that person becomes the teacher. Bree has become our teacher. And I think it's just a wonderful opportunity now to listen to her talk about what she's learned and what she can help us with as we try to go forward. So,
thank you.
Bree. Well, first of all, that isn't a necklace.
No.
You're wearing a number.
Yes.
Tell us about that number and why you choose to wear it.
So 7053, this is the number that Rosa Parks was assigned when she was arrested in Montgomery, Alabama, for refusing to give up her seat to a white man on a segregated public bus. And I felt in my spirit that I wanted to wear that in honor of her memory, but also in honor of the memories of everyone who has faced persecution from a state while fighting oppression. The moment when I removed the Confederate flag is actually the second time that I was arrested. The very first time was protesting attacks on voting rights in 2013 as part of the Moral Monday movement. And yes. And prior to that, never in my life would have thought of putting myself in a position to be arrested. That was just nothing that I would have ever seen for myself. And I think once it became real to me that that was what I was about to do, and I reflected on it, and I realized actually many of the people that I most admire in my life were arrested for protesting injustice or for speaking against oppression. Not only the leaders of the civil rights movement, not only someone like Gandhi, but the apostles. And I thought about it, and I was like, well, how many apostles were taken to jail because the preaching the word that Christ had given to them put them at odds with the Roman Empire? And when I put it into perspective in that way, I realized that there is a righteousness in opposing unjust law. So I'm wearing that tonight in honor of all of those people.
Well, I know that one of the first things that Reverend Barber said when he heard about you and what you'd done and described you was the comparison with Rosa Parks.
Absolutely.
And so that must have been pretty heady.
Oh, well, heady, but yeah, there really is no greater honor than being compared to someone like a Rosa Parks. And obviously, I don't know how many people know. Obviously, she's most famous for the act of refusing to give up her seat, but she was a pretty amazing organizer. Even prior to that, she did a lot of work across the South, addressing the issue of systemic rape that a lot of Black women were experiencing across the South. So really amazing woman to be compared to.
You know, a lot of that's focus about, you know, what you did and can become about the flag. So why don't we just talk a little bit about two things. One is the flag and how it's used as a symbol, how it's maybe not thought of in the way it should be thought of, but also how that also, I think, limits the conversation. I think there's a lot more to talk there. Sometimes we can get stuck there and not go on. So why don't you sort of see if you can follow that a little bit?
Yeah, certainly. So I think there's two things that are kind of going on with the Confederate flag. One is an issue of what the Confederate flag, I would say, factually represents. And when I say factually represents, I mean, if we look at when this symbol, this flag was first created, it was first created for the purpose of representing the Confederacy, right? The Confederacy was formed when the South seceded from the Union, and the South seceded from the Union for the purpose of maintaining enslavement. I mean, that's made very clear in the Statement of Secessions from every state. So first, factually, it represents that, right? Maintaining slavery. It actually came back into popular usage in the 20th century as a symbol of anti-civil rights. The flag that we removed in South Carolina was originally raised over the dome of the Capitol in 1961. Now, they said that they raised it to honor the 100th anniversary of the Civil War, which began in 1860, so I don't know how that math works out. But some other interesting things that were happening in 1961 was you had the Rock Hill Nine, who led a sit-in. This is when, you know, sit-ins were really at their peak. This is following the Greensboro Four. But what was significant about the Rock Hill Nine was up until that point, you know, the movement was starting to run out of bail money because people were going to jail and they were having to raise the money. Well, the Rock Hill Nine, they refused bail. And that was a real turning point for the movement. So now you had people, they were like, arrest us and we'll just clog the jails. And so South Carolina raising the Confederate flag at that time, and of course there were several other states across the South that raised Confederate flags around that time, it was a clear statement of anti-civil rights. So that's the first thing we're dealing with, right? The factual history of the Confederate flag. Then we have another issue, which is the deliberate miseducation and obfuscation of that factual history. So you do have a lot of people for whom, you know, they say, well, the Confederate flag just represents the South, or it represents Southern heritage, and genuinely don't make that connection. That doesn't discount, right, the factual history that accompanies the symbol. So you know, and then to touch on the other point that you were bringing up about, you know, yes, it's about the flag, but it's not only about the flag. So there's two things that have to happen at once. It's not simply a matter of lowering the flag, right? We have to understand what the factual history is. We have to confront the miseducation that has happened. And then we have to talk about what the flag represents, right? Because the flag is just a symbol. But what it represents is systemic racism. And simply lowering a flag doesn't end that. Racism exists as policies and social practices. It's how we interact with each other. And it's also policies that really kind of regulate and mandate how we interact with each other and how society is organized. So, you know, lowering the flag, taking down Confederate monuments, that's a good step one, right? But there's a lot that has to come after that if we are really trying to address not just symbols, but substance.
Do you think that that was a terrific statement. Do you think that the mainstream media is having that discussion? I mean, it's fantastic that you're making, you know, bringing that kind of clarity to that issue right here. But is it getting out in any way that is in the larger culture, do you think?
I would say yes and no. So part of why I felt that it was important after we took the flag down to go and talk to media, and I've spent the better part of the past 2 years also lecturing and speaking on this topic, was to provide that larger context, because I think oftentimes, well, our society is not very history conscious, period. Like, I don't think we do a great job of teaching history, period, in this country. But it's especially problematic in this like 24-hour news cycle. So it's like everything is framed within this context of what happened in the past 24 hours. And it's like we almost forget everything that came before that. However, that said, I do feel like here recently following Charlottesville, and a lot of the discussion around the removal of Confederate monuments, I feel like the media started to do a better job in terms of providing that context. Like explaining, for instance, that most of the Confederate monuments that exist around this country, they were erected in the 1920s. They were erected at the height of lynching in this country. They were erected at the, when Jim Crow was really starting to really take shape across the South. And they were built to remind everyone of what the social order is. Yes, the South may have lost the Civil War, but this is still a white power structure. That's the message that was being communicated by those statues. Now, I feel like we still are constantly having to challenge the dominant narrative in order for that to be communicated kind of in mass media. But I do feel that it is at least getting out a little bit better in terms of providing some more context for that.
That's great. And along that line, I want to read a quote from Bryan Stevenson. You probably know Bryan Stevenson. He's the head of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery. Actually, he's opening a museum, I think next year, that's going to be from slavery to mass incarceration and tell the history of systemic racism in this country. Remarkable man, if you don't know him. But I just want to read you this quote from him and then have you comment on it. He said, wait a second, so I can actually read it. He said, "The great evil of American slavery was not involuntary servitude, but rather the narrative of racial differences we created to legitimate slavery. Because we never dealt with that evil, I don't think slavery ended in 1865, it just evolved." It seems that that's kind of where you're going. You want to extend that any further?
No, absolutely. I completely agree.
Yeah.
I completely agree with that analysis. And again, that is one of the dangers of not being a very history conscious society, because there are a lot of ghosts, there's a lot of skeletons, a lot of ugly things in American history that to a certain extent maybe challenge the myth that we like to believe about ourselves. And I think that is part of why it is culturally difficult for us to confront the truth of our history in a lot of ways. But I would completely agree. I think it's important to recognize that race, especially as we understand it in the United States, it really served no function outside of racism. And racism really served no function outside of, as Bryan was saying there, justifying the system of slavery. So you had a period in America, in the early period of the colonies, where indentured white servants and enslaved Africans were living in somewhat similar conditions. They began to organize and actually openly rebel against the colonial power because of that. And in response to that, after quashing the rebellion, what the British then did was to create a racial difference, a racialized difference between indentured whites and slaves. Slaves would be, held in bondage in perpetuity. White indentured servants were given more of an opportunity to actually gain freedom. They were permitted to own guns now. So the function of race, like when we talk about modern systemic racism, mass incarceration, the way that race plays out in our society today, it's important to understand that was developed over a period of about 400 years. Okay, and so when we're trying to unpack that and understand modern racism, understanding that history becomes so much more important. There is no function for racism outside of economic oppression and exploitation. That's the essential function that it serves. Even mass incarceration, people are profiting. That's $1 billion industry. It's not simply we're locking up masses of people because that's necessary for the crime rate. It's an industry. There's an industry made off of putting people in prison, profiting off of labor in prison, making money from the families who, pay for minutes to talk to relatives in prison. I mean, it's an entire industry that is traded on Wall Street in the same way that slavery was, And just the last thing I would say on that is when we're talking about systemic racism, it's important to understand chattel slavery was also systemic racism. It was a system. I think a lot of times the way that we think about slavery, obviously we have these images of, the plantation and like it's just this self-contained thing. It was the entire economy. If you're in Philadelphia wearing a cotton shirt, that cotton shirt was probably the product of a plantation in the South. You had an entire insurance industry built off of insuring slave ships and the cargo of enslaved human beings coming to this country. So it's an entire economy. And what was once chattel slavery is now the prison industrial complex.
I was thinking as you were talking, if you had never climbed up the flagpole and taken down the flag, I would have wanted to paint you just for the way you talk. You didn't have to do it. I want to follow this theme of history just a second because we were talking earlier about the relationship to Rosa Parks and the fact that even though now it's hard to go anywhere where you wouldn't find people treating her as a total icon and embracing her as a great American who did a great service for America. I was alive in 1955. I was told that she was just a woman whose feet hurt who chose to get arrested rather than move to the back of the bus. And I remember hearing horrible things being said about her, fearful things. And so it's interesting, what history does, the way she moves into a different position as she recedes in history. And even though it's only been a short time, since your historical act, I'm wondering if sort of two things. One is as it's receded, you feel it's changing its own meaning or evolving in some way. And also how it feels to you, whether you continue to learn from that act, but it means different things now than it did then.
I would say yes and no. So I think, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. And it's very interesting to be in this kind of modern movement and be able to kind of look at parallels to the past. I don't know exactly for folks who were in 1955, Montgomery, Alabama, that the same exact kind of parallels existed for them to be able to look at. And so in many ways we kind of benefit from everyone who went through the modern or the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. But yeah, absolutely. Rosa Parks was fired from her job as a seamstress. And as you were talking about how perceptions change over time, and now everybody loves Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks is hailed as a hero. I was also thinking about Muhammad Ali. And how he, really has now been embraced as an American hero. Kind of this is now a mainstream figure where everyone respects him. Standing up to injustice at the time. Yet at the same time, we see Colin Kaepernick without a job in the modern time, right? Because it's always easier. It's always easier to criticize a past generation, right? But I think we forget that many of the people who were alive during that time are still alive now. Ruby Bridges is still alive. The woman in my town of Charlotte who first integrated the schools there, she's still alive and still speaking about. This is very recent history. And so again, when I say that we need to be more history conscious, only if it's honest. Now, if we're history conscious, but we're not being honest about the history, then it serves no purpose, right? So like, for instance, if we were to talk about slavery, oh gosh, slavery was horrible. Yes, we all agree on that. But we also need to acknowledge that it was a minority of people who were abolitionists. They were in the minority at that time, the people who were actually fighting to end slavery. And so, when you think about, to us, it probably seems crazy to think that that was a radical idea at one point. But to say that slavery should end was considered radical as it is to call for prison abolition now. It was no less radical at that time. And so I think that we have to be willing to deal in discomfort. There is no such thing as, like, if there's a real change happening, it's not going to be comfortable. And that's probably one of the best measures by which we can judge whether we are actually changing or not. If it's comfortable, we're probably not really doing what we actually need to do.
Right.
In terms of like the past 2 years and kind of where I'm at now, I think that, first of all, I think I've had a more pleasant reception than many of the people who have, preceded me in this freedom struggle. I didn't lose a job, as a result of what I did. I think that for the most part, people really celebrated. A lot of people celebrated at least the flag coming down, right? Now, that's one thing. It's one thing for everybody to say, yes, we agree that the state of South Carolina should not fly the Confederate flag. That doesn't necessarily equate to, yes, let's dismantle systemic racism, right? That becomes a deeper conversation. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying a minute ago. Now we've reached a point where you have a lot of municipalities, yes, let's take down the monuments. And I'm like, okay, awesome. And as soon as you do that, let's talk about inequality in your education system and why it's like that. Yes, take the monument down, and then let's talk about why the black children in your district are disproportionately poor, why poverty levels for black children are the same today as they were in 1968. That's the conversation that we have to have after that. So, I think there's some people that are still willing to hang with me after I start pushing on those conversations, and there's some people that probably peel off. I may have lost some fans from 2 years ago, but that's fine. I mean, again, when I say that we all have to be uncomfortable, I'm talking about myself as well. If I get too comfortable, then I'm probably not doing what I really need to be doing.
Good point. I was, in terms of the history and the uncomfortableness, I mean, abolitionists were attacked in the streets in northern cities.
Absolutely.
For doing what they were doing. But I also want to say something about Muhammad Ali, who was one of the early portraits in this series. You can go into almost every school in this country, and of all the people I painted, even people like Rosa Parks, he's better known. More kids know who he is, but they have no idea why I would have painted him, other than he got in the ring with Joe Frazier. That the fact that he refused the draft in 1967, that is not being taught. And so it's what I think what we often see in history is, as the mainstream tries to embrace important activists and civil rights heroes and women's heroes. I mean, we hear Susan B. Anthony, but we don't hear Alice Paul. And as it tries to embrace them, it also tries to whitewash them a little bit and defang them.
Absolutely.
And it's like, King, we never hear his anti-war Vietnam speech.
Right.
We hear, I Have a Dream.
Right.
And it's for that same reason, to make him comfortable.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's a dominant narrative, right? And part of that is the mythos of America. I would say that the dominant narrative is, this was a nation where many people came to flee oppression, right? This is the story that we tell about ourselves. This is the nation where people come to flee oppression and persecution. And no, it wasn't perfect in the beginning, but with time and with the sacrifice of many people, we have achieved freedom, and we will continue to fight for freedom. And even if we're not perfect now, we are the beacon of freedom, for the world, and we will continue to press forward. And that's kind of how it's taught, right? And that would make it seem as though America itself has always been on the side of freedom, and which is different from really telling the history of a people. That's different from really making it clear that the rights that we enjoy today are the result of several protracted struggles that were often violent. Again, when you talk about Martin Luther King and, him being painted as this very peaceful figure, but what is often not told is the amount of violence that he was met with. So for instance, today when we're protesting, you'll often have people say, well, what about Dr. King? How would Dr. King have done it? And I'm saying, you're saying that as though nonviolent protest necessarily means that you're not met with violence. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Sure, yeah.
So you'll have a lot of people saying, well, if you would just protest a certain way, then people will stop being racist and violent towards you. And I'm like, you are forgetting the reason that we can't ask Martin Luther King today what he would do is because he was assassinated. So again,
or if you just march the children through the streets of Birmingham, they won't get out the dogs and the fire hoses.
Exactly. So again, it's like, when we are recounting history but not doing it honestly, it doesn't do us any service. We might as well, that's the same as not teaching the history at all.
Absolutely. I think, and I'd sort of like you to comment on this. One of the huge problems here is, as you were alluding to it there, is a question of identity. Mm-hmm. We're always trying to slip out of our own identities. And, it's only when, an act like yours forces us back into it, rubs our faces right into it, that we at least briefly have to face, or at least question, the identity that we're, trying to evade. And I think that's one of the, the real, and it's kind of what you're talking about in a lot of these things, is that, what is the myth, what is the real identity, and then how can we bring ourselves out of denial mm-hmm. to accept who we really are and be humbled by it, but then actually be real people.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think culturally, speaking about America, there's an ideological schism that has existed in this nation since its beginning. It existed in the minds of its founders. Right here you had Thomas Jefferson writing in the Declaration of Independence. He's arguing that it is morally justified for America to break away from British rule, that it is morally justified as a people to separate from the rule of a king. And the basis that he uses for that argument is that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. So it is not our king, it is not our ruler who endows us with these rights, but that it is inherent. It is inherently granted to us by our Creator. And not only that, it is self-evident, meaning that I should not have to, right? I'm gonna make this argument, but it's actually self-evident that we're all created equal and endowed with these rights. At the same time, he's owning slaves. And when you look through a lot of his writings, you see that he even recognized that there was an inherent contradiction in that. And so I think that, that was a seed that was planted in 1776, and now it has grown into this tree that we all live under, right? And we're all trying to make sense of it. And so now it has branches and leaves, and it's more a complex thing, but at its root is still that ideological schism between white supremacy and the system that was built underneath that, and this notion that we are a people that needs no king because we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights and we're all created equal. We are a nation of many different nations in a way, right? Obviously, this country was built as a result of genocide, as a result of slavery, as a result of many people fleeing persecution in other countries. And the fact is, when you look back over the history of this nation from first contact, as they describe it, when colonists first made contact with indigenous people, to today, I think what we see is we are trying to define what America is. That has not yet been answered. We have an idea. There was an idea that's laid out in that Declaration of Independence, but that has not yet been fully realized. And the fact is that we have, at least when I talk about my experience as an African American, we have been enslaved here far longer than we've been free. If you want to count freedom as, since the civil rights movement, we've been enslaved here 5 times as long as we have been free. So even defining what it means to be free as a Black American is something that we're still pushing for. Yes, it's written there on paper. Yes, I see that, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. Yeah, it's there on paper. But what does it actually look like in practice when I see Black person after Black person being murdered by the police and there's no accountability? You know, I see Walter Scott being shot in the back and evidence being planted on his body, and the case goes to mistrial. We see the case that just happened in St. Louis, you know. And this is the last thing I'm going to say. I pointed this out before. You know, lynching was at its peak in the early 20th century. This is when, you know, Ida B. Wells, this is when the NAACP was formed, partly in response to that. The 14th Amendment was in existence at that time, just like the Declaration of Independence was in existence at that time, right? So simply writing something on paper, I mean, in the same way I say, like, just lowering a flag, simply doing those things, that doesn't make reality what it is.
I want to ask you, I mean, I think when you were alluding to the problem of Jefferson, you put your finger on something that is, you know, also systemic in this country, which is that we often allow ourselves to have our ethics shaped by the demands of economy, or what we might call the rights of economy, rather than the demands of our own morality. And we see that in every privatized system that goes on in this country, that we allow, you know, what economy needs to do to make a profit to dictate our ethics in response to it. How do we get out of that? How do we deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Martin Luther King spoke to that pretty well when he talked about the need to move from a thing-oriented society to a people-oriented society. He talked about, you know, the triplet evils of racism, militarism, and extreme materialism. And I think we're at that point now. The earth is a finite thing. That's a fact. The earth is a finite thing with finite resources. Human beings are also finite. And there's just a certain point past which you cannot exploit everything. You cannot chop everything down into something that you can put a price tag on and commodify it. I mean, I don't know, if I were to ask you what is the dollar value of your life, can you answer that for me? But I mean, that's what slavery was. Slavery was putting a dollar amount on someone's life. Now, obviously, I said before, I'm a Christian. So I mean, if you push me too much on that, I'm going to start getting theological on, you know, this whole notion of materialism and commodifying everything to the point that we have lost sight of human rights. You know, you talked about the right of economy. Yes, but again, when we go back to the Declaration of Independence, the argument, they did protest a lot of times over, you know, tyranny in the form of taxation and things like that. But the moral argument for revolting against the king was that we had certain inalienable rights. And I think I would certainly argue that I think the main issue of the 21st century is human rights. What does it mean to be a human? And what are the rights that we are entitled to as a human being, regardless of skin color, religion, sexual identity, gender identity, just the fact that I am a human being? Does that not entitle me to humanity and to humane treatment?
Right. Absolutely. And I think probably a much deeper understanding of what the common good entails, and not just in terms of economy and community, but environment and, you know, everything that entails how we survive together and live in health on this planet.
Absolutely, understanding the interdependence between everything.
Yeah. Yeah, I was talking to some kids in the school yesterday, and we were talking about the sort of the metaphor of using the web of life, which seemed to be very poorly understood, and then the web of values, that they have to synchronize with each other, and that's if we want to survive and also be in peace with each other. I wanted you a little while ago you mentioned just very briefly Colin Kaepernick, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about what he represents to you, and here we've got, your two flags. We've got a flag that is, I think in a lot of people's minds, it's not being clearly explained what he's really doing in relationship to a flag, as though he's, in a sense, doing what you were doing. He's trying to take down a flag, whereas, of course, that's not it at all. But how do you think about him and those flags?
Yeah, so I think it is two different things. So in my instance, I was taking down the flag because of what it represents. In Colin Kaepernick's instance, he's refusing to stand because he says the flag is, this society is not matching what we say that flag represents. That's a different thing. Honestly, when I first saw his protest, I was like, good for him. Like, I didn't, I was like, good for him. Like, good for him standing up because obviously athletes are very powerful figures in our society. And I kind of remember around that time, there was just this sense of wanting our athletes to show more of a response to what was going on. In Charlotte, we had an uprising going on, and we had the games going on at Panther Stadium, and it's like, are you going to acknowledge what is going on out here in the street? But in retrospect, like as I see it now, I don't know if Colin Kaepernick thought it through, like if he was thinking, wow, this is the NFL, if I do this in this way, it's really going to reverberate throughout the world. I don't know if that's what he was thinking, because he doesn't really seem to be craving media attention. That doesn't seem to be his interest at all. And it was only because someone asked him that he made it clear why he wasn't standing. But I think why it has become the issue that it is because in many ways the NFL is like the state-sponsored religion of the United States, and and the Super Bowl is like Christmas or Easter Sunday, or you've got the huge advertisers, you've got like the closest thing we have to modern gladiators and the NFL, and the NFL sports teams. And I think it also kind of, again, it reflects back to us how we want to see ourselves, right? It's a level playing field. I remember I had a cousin who told me that he loved football because it was just raw fairness. Like it's like people come onto the field, and whoever wins is whoever played the best that day. It's just a level playing field. And so I think in that way, this whole ritual that we have around watching these football games kind of reflects back to us this Americana that we want to believe in. Now, when a black athlete refuses to stand for the anthem, he's forcing everyone to be conscious that he is black. And when we look at what has happened in this past week with Trump's like racially explosive comments about the NFL, it is racialized because the NFL is also a predominantly black athlete sport. The majority of athletes in the NFL are black. And so for them to protest in that way and say, yes, you know me as this number, you know me by my stats, but when I leave here and I take this uniform off, I'm in the same position as everybody else who's out here. I mean, Michael Bennett, he was held at gunpoint by police in Las Vegas. So LeBron James had someone spray paint nigger on his gate. So simply having a certain amount of money or a certain position doesn't remove them from the reaches of racism. I think what is most offensive to people, yes, there's some people who are offended by the protesting of the anthem, but I think it's more the disruption in the consciousness. It's more, you can turn away when the news is showing protests breaking out somewhere, but then when they're interrupting your sporting event, and now you can't look away.
Well, a lot of these issues that have come up around this I sometimes feel like this way, that a lot of activists, we work for years and years and years to try to get some kind of voice in the major media around these issues. We're turned down all the time. A professional athlete makes a statement, and the reason people the rest of the culture, status quo, comes down so heavily is because he's got the major media. He's got that voice, and that's why they jump on him so hard to put him down, And so what happened with all these other teams, linking arms and kneeling together and in solidarity, that was amazing because it actually legitimates that first voice and makes it very hard for the major media then to condemn him. But I also want to say, I mean, one of the things that, and maybe you want to talk about this, but we see with this, when people say, oh, well, it's a shame to see, something like football politicized. Whereas, really? I mean, don't we watch these games and see that every game is a celebration of militarism?
Yeah.
And it's already so deeply politicized that what we're expected here with that kind of propaganda. And this is, I think, this is the way a lot of this systemic stuff works. It's so propagandized that it's supposed to be like fish in water. We don't even see what it is, because it is so politicized. And then somebody points that out, and you go, oh no! You know. But
no, I mean, I don't believe that anything is apolitical. I don't believe there's apolitical art. I don't believe there's apolitical education, and there's no such thing as apolitical sports, because the way that everything that we do and the way that we do it is informed by a certain politic. I saw somebody tweet the other day, which I thought was really spot on, is that the norm is political, right? So that's part of what you're talking about. We're fish in water, we may not be aware of the water. That norm is also political. It's informed by a certain viewpoint. And sports have never been apolitical. Football has never been apolitical. The existence, so Colin Kaepernick is a black quarterback protesting, right? Black athletes had to fight even to get into the position of quarterback. Right. You know what I mean? So we can't disconnect Colin Kaepernick being forced out of a job for protesting from that history.
Right, yeah. You just mentioned art a little bit. You're an artist. I mean, besides everything else,
yes.
You've done filmmaking, you do music, and you've talked about art as activism.
Yes.
Why would you choose art to use art for activism, and why do you think it's an important vehicle for activism?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I've been an artist my whole life. That's just a part of my identity. And I've even seen the quote where they say an artist is the child who never grew up, or who I can't remember exactly how they put it. Maybe not grew up, but who survived. That's how they put it. They said an artist is the child who survived, and I believe that to a certain extent, because I think creativity is just a part of being human and kind of what we do. So I think art has just always been with me. I think that what is maybe different now is that I am more conscious of the ways in which I weave art and activism together. So a lot of art that I have done over my life was, I guess, political to a certain extent, or I just tend to make art in response to what I'm observing, and so in that way, of course, it ends up being either political or social commentary, to a certain extent.
Why do you think it's a good way to get people to look at the issues and the ideas you're talking about?
Well, I think that's part of the essential power of art. It can be sometimes a film that has a tremendous impact on a generation's way of viewing something. One example that comes to mind is Philadelphia. I don't know if you're familiar with Philadelphia with Tom Hanks. The AIDS crisis was going on for a long time at that point, but that film played a huge part, a huge role in humanizing those who had been advocating around this issue. And that's just the simple fact of the power of art sometimes. Sometimes it can be an image. I will never forget the first moment I saw Guernica by Pablo Picasso, because I knew nothing about the Spanish Civil War. I knew nothing about that history, but the first time that I was exposed to that painting, it was such a powerful image that it compelled me to learn about that. Now, I can't tell you every thing that I've read about it, but I can tell you about the moment that I saw that painting.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, listen, I think it's a good time to open up this discussion to other people. And I want to maybe just read or ask one more question, and then I'd love to have first children or young people come, and then anyone else come and ask some questions of Bree. You said, I have a list of quotes here that, when I was painting your portrait, one of the things, and of course I think I sent them all to you, one of the things I was doing was looking at speeches, interviews, and things, and collecting your quotes, and then trying to decide which one to put on the painting, and then we worked that out. But talk about the role of fear at one time. I mean, in our culture, in our politics, in our history. I mean, you said, I refuse to be ruled by fear. How can America be free and be ruled by fear? How can anyone be?
Yeah. Fear is a huge part of our politics. Now, I'm 32. Obviously, I haven't been here forever. I can only speak from what I have experienced in my life. But I do remember how America was before 9/11. And I'm not saying everything, I'm not going to do what I criticized us all of doing before and say that everything was perfect, or kind of whitewash history in a way. But I feel that I did see fear become more a part of what was motivating everything. Decisions, policy, how we're interacting with each other, being motivated by fear. And if the goal here, is to create this pluralistic society that we say America is supposed to be, we can't operate off of fearing each other. First of all. Secondly, what I was speaking to in that quote, and as it showed in the video, I did feel a lot of fear after the massacre happened at Mother Emanuel to a certain extent. And part of my personal decision in scaling the flagpole and removing the flag was that I was not going to allow myself to be dominated and ruled by fear. We simply can't allow ourselves to be. Here you had a white supremacist, he went into a church at nighttime and murdered 9 people, several of whom were elderly women, and then snuck off and ran away, a very cowardly act. And we chose deliberately, by contrast. Now, we had talked about maybe just taking the flag and making away with it at night before anybody saw us. But then we thought through it, and we were like, we want to draw a clear contrast. We will do this in bright daylight, in front of everyone. I'm putting myself in a very vulnerable position. And I'm prepared to be arrested because I will not allow myself to be ruled by fear. Not only as a part of the civil rights movement, but as a Christian again. I can't. If you're asking me what motivates me, I'm here because I follow Jesus, and I don't believe Jesus does not give us a spirit of fear. First of all, and I prayed on it a good deal, and I believed that I would come out safely from it. But even if I didn't, I was prepared for that scenario as well. And it would still be known that we did not allow ourselves to be dominated by fear in that moment.
Right. When we talk about being dominated by fear, I would probably use the word manipulated.
Yes.
I mean, we are constantly manipulated by fear in this culture, and it was the way we got into the Iraq War, was that kind of manipulation. Anyway, thank you. I mean,
yes,
it's just amazing what you say and how you say it and the way you frame your issues and all of our issues and also the history.
Yeah.
I would love it if some people would come forward and ask questions now. Are there any young people who want to ask some questions? We'd like to
take those questions first from kids. So if you
so
would.
Come on up and come to the microphone, or have the microphone come to you.
Good evening, folks. I'm Donovan Spencer. To me, you like a celebrity, but I was just wondering, how did it make you feel to go up there and stand up and actually take that flag down and actually stand up for us? How did that make you feel?
Free. I mean, honestly, that was the moment where I feel like I became completely free, if that makes sense. Does
Absolutely.
That make sense? I understand now, again, like I said, I'm wearing kind of this number in memory and honor of all those who walked that path before, but I understand when they put me in the jail cell, I felt completely free. Because I wasn't there because I was busted for a crime or something wrong that I had done. I was there because I was standing up for a righteous cause, and simply putting me behind bars can't chain my spirit or my mind.
You know, one of the great storytellers and songsters of the working movement, the workers' movement, was Utah Phillips. And he said, the degree to which you resist injustice is the degree to which you are free. And I think, you proved that when
Yes.
Camilo Mejia, who was the first American to go to jail for refusing to fight anymore in the Iraq War, he said, I won't kill civilians, I won't torture people. They're asking me to do these things. And then he went to jail and he said, finally, I'm a free man.
Yeah.
And that's obviously, that's what you did. And
Yeah.
you found your freedom.
Yeah, absolutely.
How long were you arrested for?
Great question. And I'm so glad that there are young people here. That's really important. So I was held in jail for about 7 hours. And it was really interesting when we were down there, we didn't really have exposure to what was going on. I think by the time we were being processed, we knew that the flag had been raised back up. So I was like, well, I wasn't sure what impact it had made. And then there's a point at which they bring you into the nurse's office to get swabbed, and they collect your DNA and everything. And that was when she told me that Dwayne Wade, the basketball player, had offered to pay my bail. And I was like, okay, I guess it's, the word has spread, yeah. Of course, by the time I got out, then I was able to see everything that had happened.
Should have asked him to pay your rent, too.
Hi, my name's Serenity, and I'm sorry. And I was just wondering, how do you think you impacted the youth, and for the youth that you did impact, how do you encourage them to move on in this type of work?
Awesome, that's a great question. So I honestly, I continue to be humbled by the impact that moment had. And I say that because I really recognize that it's bigger than me. And I hope that y'all can really receive that when I say that it's bigger than me. I feel honored and blessed that I was able to participate in that moment and to be the one to do that. But it was bigger than me. And when I saw all the artistic depictions and everything, it really came to represent not just freedom, but I recognized how significant that was to see a Black woman unhooking the Confederate flag in South Carolina. And so I've seen an impact on a lot of youth, but particularly young Black women, young Black girls. It has really meant a lot to them to see a figure of Black empowerment in that way. And in terms of what I encourage the youth to do is to learn how to act on your conscience. Now, I made that decision because I knew my history. I knew the history of my family. My family had been enslaved in South Carolina. So I understood what that represented in that moment when South Carolina was refusing to lower the Confederate flag, and they had the Confederate flag flying above the American flag and the South Carolina state flag. So because I was informed, I was able to make a decision based on my conscience about what I wanted to do with that, and then apply what skills I had to that. So that's the main message that I would give to young people as you're moving through life and you're deciding who you are and who you want to be. In this world, I just pray that you have the courage to act on your convictions, whatever that looks like. I think sometimes people think that unless you're doing something as dramatic as, climbing a flagpole, that you're not doing anything. Somebody had to teach Martin Luther King. For us to have a Martin Luther King, he had a teacher. You might be if you're not the figure necessarily who's in the history books, that doesn't mean that you're not making a huge impact. We tend to remember history as certain figures and moments, but the truth is that social movement is millions of people doing millions of things in millions of places.
Yeah. People like Bayard Rustin teaching King.
Absolutely.
Who had to be kept in the shadows.
Absolutely.
When you were saying that, I was thinking, here was this, young, unsure in some respects, but and very sure in other respects. Vulnerable person, individual, climbing a flagpole to take down a symbol. Mm-hmm. In the process, you become the symbol.
Absolutely.
And that is what changes history, and that's what I think you really mean by you become bigger than yourself. It's not about you anymore. It's become a force and an idea which you then symbolize, and that is what carries that message then to so many other people.
Absolutely. If I could just say real quickly, that was part of our goal. So once we decided that we were going to take the flag down, once we decided that the tactic to do it was to scale a pole, once we figured out who could be arrested, that narrowed it down to about 3 of us. And of those people, I was the only person of color. We started thinking about symbolism. And obviously, it's powerful to see a black woman scaling the flagpole, a descendant of those who were enslaved in South Carolina. And then that's when we made the decision also for James Tyson as a white man to be the one to help me over the fence and stand guard as I climb. So as I came down, I can hand the flag over to him, because symbolically that symbolizes the struggle to dismantle white supremacy. And so in creating this new symbol, we counter what had been a symbol of segregation with a new symbol of liberation.
Yeah, that's great.
Is the flag still down?
Yes, that's a great question. So actually, the flag that I took down was placed in a box as evidence, which is really interesting. I learned about afterward. So it was placed in a box to be as evidence, and then they raised another flag. So the second flag that they raised is the one that was lowered in the official flag ceremony that they did. There's still controversy over what they want to do with that flag. Some people were pushing for it to be displayed in a Civil War museum in a display that would have cost like $5 million. And of course, the argument against that was that this has no connection to the Civil War. It was a flag, particularly that particular flag, it flew for about 14 days after I took the other one down. And it's nylon, it was not made in the 1860s. It has no connection to anything. Yeah.
My name is Will Griffin. I'm on the National Board of Directors of Veterans for Peace, and we completely support your work and everything that you've done so far. So thank you for that. You mentioned earlier Dr. King talking about racism and materialism, but there was another third thing that he talked about was militarism. So Veterans for Peace has a campaign called Peace at Home, Peace Abroad, where we make the connection, the racist connection, from the racist domestic policies we have here to the racist foreign policies we have overseas. And we believe we can't have one without having the other. So militarism wasn't really addressed in this conversation, but I think, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. Do you see connections between our foreign policies where we're dropping bombs on black and brown people overseas and locking up people and shooting people, black and brown people here at home? And if you don't, how can we move forward if we don't address this issue? Thank you.
So, yes. So, first of all, thank you for your support. I appreciate that. Me too. Yes, absolutely. So I spoke earlier, I made mention of the prison industrial complex, but it's probably even more accurate to describe it as the military prison industrial complex, because all of those things are connected. And I mean, quite literally, like, you have prison labor is being used to produce uniforms, military equipment. So in terms of the industry and the profit that is made off of both of prisons and military, those things are interconnected.
Tomorrow night, here a little bit, she's going to be at the VMI.
His mic is on. He had to step out real quick.
Why am I?
He doesn't know his mic.
Yeah, we'll have her unveil her portrait and everything.
He might be really hurt, because apparently he certainly has politics around privacy, so that'll be a little unfortunate for him. But in all seriousness, yes, they are absolutely connected. And the thing I think, again, to understand about racism, I think a lot of times the way that we speak of it is kind of in a more interpersonal kind of way. So, somebody calling you a racial slur or something. But racism as a system is global. That's a global thing. It's global because European colonization was global. It's global because the slave trade was global. And so, when we look at the fact that you have a lot of people who end up serving in the military because for many people, it's their only means of economic or access to economic opportunity or educational opportunity. I had many friends like that. I was in high school when the Iraq War started, and I had several friends for whom the military was their main option. Many of them were from low-income families, and they were people of color. Obviously, many of the nations that end up getting exploited through the military-industrial complex are nations of color, people of color. Martin Luther King, when he was speaking on that, he was taking the particular example of the Vietnam War, where here you had a disproportionate amount of the folks who were being drafted were poor, were black, were Latinx, and they were being sent over to Vietnam to bomb and kill other poor people of color. I mean, exactly as Muhammad Ali put it. So my short answer, yes, and then my long answer is everything that followed, I guess. Yeah.
Who inspired you?
Hi, thank you. That's a great question. I feel like I'm inspired by many people. Obviously, Rosa Parks was definitely an inspiration. And you were mentioning before how oftentimes the way that story is taught is that she was the seamstress, she was just tired and her feet hurt. That whole thing was very planned out and calculated. She was an experienced organizer. She knew exactly what she was doing by volunteering to put herself in that position. So Rosa Parks was certainly an inspiration, obviously. Martin Luther King, John Lewis, many of those who participated in civil disobedience in the past. I mean, I did this action deliberately in the spirit that Martin Luther King lays out in Letter from a Birmingham Jail, and for the same reasons. Not just politically, but also spiritually, I'll say again. I mean, that's exactly what informed my decision to do that there is such a thing as an unjust law. And that when we are confronted with unjust laws, the moral thing to do is to defy them until we make those laws just.
I just want to thank you for inspiring me.
Oh, thank you.
My first question is, if this would have never happened, where would you be in life? And my second, my first question, if you would have never took down the flag, or if anything, what would you be wanting to do?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So had I not taken down the flag, I'd probably still be doing what I was doing before, and really what I'm still doing now, which is I'm a community organizer in Charlotte, North Carolina. And so what that basically means is, I'm trying to think of a way to put that besides just saying I organize the community. I didn't know what a community organizer was. It was just kind of something that I fell into, but I mainly tried to help the community organize around issues in order to get their needs met. And so that's what I was doing prior to taking down the flag. That's what I continue to do. In terms of getting into that role, though, I had never foreseen that for my life before 2012. I was artist in residence at Saatchi & Saatchi Ad Agency in New York. I went to school to study film. I was very much just focused on, pursuing a career, maybe in entertainment or as an artist. And then what happened was the Trayvon Martin case happened. So this was the summer of 2013. We had the acquittal of George Zimmerman for the murder of Trayvon Martin, which to me very much felt like a modern day Emmett Till. I don't know if y'all are familiar with Emmett Till, who was lynched in 1955 in Mississippi. And his case was also kind of a sparking moment for the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. And then also the attack on voting rights. So those two things together, it really caused me to question, how much am I taking my rights for granted? And what am I doing to make sure that these rights still exist for myself and for future generations? And so that was when I made this conscious decision to become an activist in the way that I have.
The backdrop for yours being the massacre in the church.
Yes.
And when Rosa Parks was asked, obviously she was trained, she'd gone to Highlander, all this stuff had been done. She was ready, although she wasn't like she knew that day it would happen, it just happened. But she was ready to do it. But asked later how she kept her courage up. at that moment, what she was thinking. She said Emmett Till. And it was just like what was going on for you. She was looking at the face of Emmett Till and realizing that no matter how scared she was, this is what she had to do because of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
What more questions? More kids, great.
Question was, do you ever get overwhelmed around people who are like against you?
Who are against me, you said? That's a really good question. Yes and no. I mean, there's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of trauma involved in all of this, right? Not just in terms of the history and like kind of the traumatic history that we're dealing with, but I mean the trauma of the present. The massacre in Charleston was very traumatic. And even the act of scaling the pole, even though that, it was a success ultimately, that was also a traumatic experience in a lot of ways. I mean, I had to make peace with the possibility that I might not survive that action when I went into it. And so, I would count dealing with opposition or the threat of it kind of just among that trauma that we deal with. But again, back to, living in fear. I really I have two choices, right? Either I can walk in truth and be bold in that and deal with whatever consequences I may face from that, or I can choose the opposite. This to me is a form of death. This may lead to danger. There may be danger involved in this. But walking this path is walking in freedom and light and life. And I mean, even my family doesn't like to hear me talk about this way, but I'll be completely honest with you. I mean, even if my life were to end tomorrow, I have walked a path of freedom. I've walked a path of truth in terms of my faith. I'm walking according to my faith. And so whatever comes of that, I'm willing to accept. If I walk this path, whatever comes of that is a consequence of me choosing cowardice.
So we're going to continue taking questions, and this is Stephanie Swepson Twitty from the YMI. Yeah.
Good evening. Again, thank all of you for coming and being a part of this awesome moment with us. I'm quickly reminded as a practicing Christian, Bree, that to whom much is given, much is required. And truly, you were given countenance and strength of character, and you have exercised that and ability to articulate that. And thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm here before you now, again, because each of us have a role to play in continuing the work, and we can do that in a myriad of ways. And CoThink, which is Asheville's African American Philanthropic Giving Circle, along with the NAACP, are two organizations that are on the forefront of doing equity and inclusion and social justice work here in Asheville. And so Americans Who Tell the Truth have given us an opportunity to ask you to donate to those two causes this evening. So I'm going to ask my friend and associate Aisha Adams if she'll come and help me with this, lift this donation.
In the meantime, so as the baskets go around, please be generous and let's ask some more questions.
How come you were in jail for such a short time?
Great question. Why was I in jail for such a short time? I mean, I think there's a number of factors. Depending on when you get processed in jail, impacts when you get out. This sounds like such a weird conversation to have. But like, why do I know this stuff? But so like the first time that I was arrested, I went, that was like in the evening when we were in there. And that was significant because there was a risk of some of us getting held overnight. And they, in fact, held one of the folks who was actually the only black man who was arrested with us when we protested over voting rights, was held, made to put on a prison jumpsuit. They took him through like the whole thing and made us think that they were going to hold him overnight. So I think part of why I was released so early was because I went into jail so early that morning. And then we already had it arranged for our attorneys to come and bail us out. So we were prepared for all of that. And two, it was a national news story. You had Free Bree trending on Twitter. You had people asking, where was I? Why had I been arrested? So I think there was also some political pressure to get me released from jail.
Hello. Thank you so much for coming to Asheville, and it's really wonderful to hear you speak. Was wondering, coming to the moment where you're about to do something really scary, is there like a little mantra or catchphrase you tell yourself as to like build yourself up as you go forth?
I really try to maintain an awareness of God, honestly. And that's kind of a daily practice and a daily walk. But certainly at that time when I was scaling the pole, if you've seen the video, you see where I'm, reciting scripture at certain points. And that was in a large part to kind of maintain my focus and maintain my peace. And actually, I had a remarkable sense of peace when I was scaling the pole. There were moments in like the lead up to it over days where I would have kind of like waves of fear and just kind of like questioning, like, am I doing the right thing? But when I was actually scaling the pole, I had a tremendous sense of peace and focus. Yeah, sure.
Oh, is it on? Hello.
Hi.
So you and I'm so glad that you are here in Asheville. You and I share some overlap in organizing connections in Greensboro and Durham.
Okay.
And I haven't come across in organizing in those communities the kind of splintering that I have witnessed here. And locally, the division and othering within the organizing and anti-racist community really makes it hard for me to hold on to hope in the movement. And as you know, it takes a lot of your own emotional, you have to sustain that to be able to keep going. And so I'm wondering, in the work that you do, how you work through divisiveness among those working for freedom, ostensibly together.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and it's an ongoing thing that I'm learning, as we go through it. So when we're in like the space together where we're organizing, it's really easy to come together and say, yeah, we're gonna fight for liberation, we're gonna fight against the system, right? But what we immediately encounter in working with each other is how much we have internalized a lot of those very things that we are fighting against. And I don't just mean like, racism or homophobia or things like that. I mean power, like our understanding of power and what that looks like, because we are so used to, a kind of like hierarchy of power and one leader type model or somebody, having dominance over someone else. And so learning how to share power, learning how to deal with conflict in a way that's healthy, because a lot of the ways that we deal with conflict kind of in the dominant society is not healthy at all. And so it's like, it's a constant process. I can't say that I am an expert in how to do any of that. I think that at the end of the day, I think again, it comes back to the question of what does it mean to be human? And how do we apply that to our understanding of how we interact with each other? I see people, I have seen in some of these spaces where people talk about, liberation, like in this great kind of, theoretical kind of manner, but then fail to demonstrate love in the most basic ways to the people who are sitting beside them. And so again, we have to examine not only what are we fighting against, but what are we fighting for? Not only what are we taking down, but what are we building up? And that first brick that builds whatever that is that we're building, that starts between the two people who are coming together to build it, right? And so I think, again, if we are not constantly examining what does it mean to have empathy for each other as we do this work, then we're not really doing the work.
Can I add something to that? I think that's a great answer. I think one of the things that's so important is to, kind of go back to something you were talking a lot about before, which is looking at the history of other movements and seeing that, and getting groups that you're trying to work with to look at that together and see. For instance, we talk about often the civil rights movement and sort of follow the arc of Martin Luther King's life. Whereas by 1965, the civil rights movement was falling apart because of the internal antagonism.
Absolutely.
And so and why that was happening, and the fact that these people couldn't see or agree on a common goal, or if they could, they couldn't agree on how to get there, and then, they were just at each other's throats. And I think that is, studying the history of movements and requiring ourselves to talk with each other about what our goal is, what we've got to do to stay together, and do we really want to get there together? And face that question is really important.
And we have to pursue more than just power.
Yeah.
We're like shifting power is part of the process, but seeking power can't be the end goal in and of itself.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, we just don't want to replace power with power. It's got to be a whole different goal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Why do you think that we are seeing the rise in popularity of movements such as the alt-right and white nationalist movements?
That is an excellent question. Very good question. So I think that in short, we're seeing the rise of the alt-right and other white nationalist movements in response to the country changing and going in a direction that they don't like. And there's a history and a pattern of this. So it's important to recognize segregation didn't start immediately after the Civil War. What happened was we had a civil war in this country. There were amendments made to the Constitution that were supposed to guarantee rights for newly freed blacks in this country. And then we had a period of about 12 years of Reconstruction, during which we're supposed to be, dedicated to, to granting voting rights to black Americans and all these various things. In response to the gain that started to be made, because black Americans started making tremendous gain just in that brief period of time, there was a backlash. This is when you had the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. This is when you started to see things like the Wilmington riots in North Carolina, driving out a black legislature, with violence. And then the imposition of Jim Crow, which lasted for about another 100 years. I would argue, Dr. Barber has actually put this forward too, that what we are living through now could be described as the third Reconstruction period. So now we had segregation, we had the civil rights movement, we have seen a certain amount of gains that have come about as a result of the civil rights movement, culminating in the election of the nation's first black president. And the backlash that we are seeing now with the election of Donald Trump, with the rise of the alt-right neo-Nazis movement, is a response to not only the election of Obama, but what the election of Obama represented, right? Obama was elected by this coalition of young people, of students, of people of color, women. Like it represented this kind of new political spectrum in the nation, and it reflects the changing demographics of the country. A lot of the backlash that we're seeing now, the anti-immigrant sentiment, a lot of the policies that are being pushed under the Trump administration is really in response to that. And I think that's why this is such a critical point in time, and why I so often point back to that period of Reconstruction, is to remind everyone we had civil rights that were then taken away. Okay, we had black Americans who were elected from this state to Congress in the 19th century. And then we had a period of about 100 years where there were no black representatives in Congress. So I'm saying all this to say that it is dangerous for us to think that rights are just simply gained in this country and that they can't be taken away. Yeah. So we have to be so vigilant in this period of time, because so many of our rights are under attack right now. And if we're not diligent about pushing back and not allowing that to happen, we could very well find ourselves in a point 50 years from now that is much worse than it is now. We could be 2 generations from now and people are in conditions that are much worse than we're living in right now. That was the experience for black Americans in 1930.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Let me just end with...
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.